At the couple's dinner, my wife smiled as she said, "This is Rick, my boss." It wasn't her smile that bothered me. It was his. A lopsided, narrow smile, too intimate for a group setting. A smile that seemed to know more than it should. A smile given to someone sharing the kind of secret that changes everything behind closed doors. At that moment, my stomach churned. There was no apparent reason, no proof, no concrete sign, but when you know someone deeply, you know the exact moment love slipped through your fingers. In that instant, I knew. Not like someone who suspects. I knew like someone watching their own life crumble in slow motion. And yet, I remained there, sitting, smiling. Pretending. Waiting for the main course while my appetite died, choked in my chest. The following days were a silent puzzle. I wasn't sure of anything, just the feeling that I was no longer a priority. Her eyes were always tired, her phone always face down, the showers longer, the silences more frequent. It wasn't just lingering kisses in the kitchen or spontaneous texts during work hours anymore. It was about absences. Detours. A distance that couldn't be explained, but could be felt. I started looking for clues not because I wanted confirmation, but because I needed the right to feel what was already suffocating me. I sifted through the junk mail, recovered deleted messages, compared schedules. And everything started to fall into place. The dinners at odd hours, the last-minute appointments, the meetings that never ended. She wasn't just distant. She was involved. Trapped. With someone else. The night everything made sense, I didn't scream. I didn't break glasses. I didn't make a scene. I just sat on the couch and waited for her to arrive. When she came in, her hair hastily tied up and her perfume slightly different, she looked at me as if everything was normal. I simply said, "Our marriage ends here." First, she denied it. She laughed nervously, tried to change the subject. Then, she cried. She tried to justify herself, tried to blame me, tried to turn my pain into an overreaction. But I was already far away. Not physically. But emotionally, far from where she left me. So far that no apology would be able to reach me. She fell to her knees, saying it wasn't what I thought, that she was confused, that she felt alone. That I didn't see her the way I used to. That she needed to feel desired. But the truth is, I did see her. I saw her more than she could see herself. The problem is, she didn't want to be seen by me, she wanted to be seen by someone else. The worst part of betrayal isn't the physical, it's the emotional abandonment. It's knowing that the person you built a home with chose to tear down every wall without warning. It's the complicit silence between two bodies that no longer recognize each other. I left with my head held high, without a fuss. Without looking back. I took with me only my dignity and the certainty that I would never beg for a position where I had been discarded. That boss, with that indecent smile, disappeared from her life as soon as he learned of the divorce. Evaporated. As if she were a risk he refused to carry. And that's when she understood. It wasn't love. It was vanity. It was need disguised as passion. It was adrenaline that was never meant to last. For weeks, she sent me empty, meaningless messages, trying to recover the irretrievable. I read each one and deleted it. Not because it didn't hurt. But because I knew that any response from me would be the door she'd use to return. And I had already locked that door from the inside. I began to rebuild my life slowly, unhurriedly. Not with resentment, but with care. I met new people, rediscovered myself, smiled again without guilt. Until I met someone. Someone who didn't need to hide messages. Who didn't trade presents for apologies. Who held my hand with the ease of someone who owed nothing to anyone. For the first time in years, I felt light. At peace. Months later, she appeared again. He knocked on my door with swollen eyes and a shaky voice. He said he missed me, that the emptiness was unbearable. He knew he had destroyed everything, but only now did he understand what he had lost. I let her speak. I let her cry. I listened calmly, like someone listening to an old song, knowing the melody no longer belongs to the present. When it ended, I said I forgave her. Not to start over, but to bring closure. To free myself from the pain she no longer had the power to cause. Love had already died. And she, finally, was left alone. With the echo of her own choice. Today, I follow a different path. A path where there are no secrets. Where peace replaces jealousy, and respect is the foundation. But there's something I'll never forget. The day she tried to come back. The day she looked at me as if begging for a chance, and saw, behind me, the woman who now occupies the space that was once hers. And in that moment, silently, she knew. Too late. Because some things break in a way that not even time can mend. And as much as she wanted to go back, there was already someone occupying the place where she could have been happy. But the most curious thing of all, what no one expected, happened much later, when she tried to change her story, thinking there was still time to go back. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, and they have a clear purpose, to show how infidelity destroys lives, trusts and true loves. Prepare to immerse yourself in an intense, moving, and painfully human narrative. Buckle up, because what follows is a shocking story. David always believed that true love didn't require grand daily demonstrations or pressured promises. He believed in silent care, constant respect, and presence. It was with this simplicity that he built his life alongside Emma, a woman with an easy smile, sweet words, and a quiet ambition that blended with a sincere desire to be admired. They met when they were young, when commitment seemed lighter and promises of eternal love were confined to long hugs on Sunday nights. Gradually, their relationship evolved. David saw in Emma not only the woman he fell in love with, but a true companion, with whom he would share not only his bed, but also difficult decisions, long-term plans, and the comfortable silence of nights when exhaustion spoke louder than any conversation. Together, they built a home without luxury, but with personality. Every object in the house had a story. The living room sofa was purchased with David's end-of-year bonus, the entryway rug was a gift from Emma's sister, the painting on the wall was painted by a friend who frequented their impromptu Friday night dinners. Everything there exuded familiarity. It was the kind of home where shoes were left at the door, coffee was freshly brewed, and the details spoke volumes. There was a certain ritual in the routines. Mornings began with light kisses, and evenings ended with conversations about the day, even if they were just grumbling about the traffic or accumulated fatigue. David, a stable and methodical accountant, felt complete in this setting, where nothing was extraordinary, but everything was comfortable. Emma, for her part, always had a certain spark. He worked at a marketing firm and carried a presence that drew attention wherever he went. She was intelligent, articulate, and possessed an elegance that didn't depend on expensive brands, but rather on a natural confidence reflected in her gestures, her speech, and even the way she crossed her legs. She was never the type of woman to go unnoticed, but she always made it clear that the love of her life was this calm, soft-spoken man with a shy sense of humor. When she spoke of David, her eyes softened, and there was always a subtle smile on the corners of her mouth. All their friends saw them as a balanced couple, despite their obvious differences. He was the safe haven. She, the gentle breeze. And for years, it worked with admirable ease. Time passed, and with it came responsibilities. Emma's work pressure increased, requiring her to attend meetings and evening events more frequently. She began traveling more frequently, meeting clients in other states, spending more time in hotels than at home. David, always understanding, tried to remain calm in the face of change. He didn't complain when she gave him last-minute notice about a business dinner or when she postponed weekend plans. Instead, he cheered for her and her achievements, even if it meant seeing her less. When Emma reached a leadership position in the company, he prepared a special dinner to celebrate. It was his way of saying, "I'm with you, even when distance seems to impose itself. Over time, however, something began to change. Not abruptly, but like a fog that slowly settles in, making everything less clear. Their conversations became shorter. Texts throughout the day, once constant, became rare. Sundays lost their flavor, and Mondays began to arrive without them having actually connected over the weekend. David noticed the absences but tried to justify them with fatigue, stress, or adult life. Emma, on the other hand, seemed increasingly distracted, as if she were present only physically. Her eyes no longer lingered on his. The smile, still there, seemed more automatic, as if programmed to avoid questions. Even so, he still believed. He loved that woman with everything he had. Not with explosive intensity, but with that depth only mature love knows. He believed that every relationship goes through difficult phases. That true love knew how to wait. Davi still left notes in her purse. He still made her favorite coffee on Saturdays. I still tried to keep the small gestures alive, even when the reciprocity was no longer the same. Emma, for her part, became increasingly silent about her feelings. When asked, she would say everything was fine. That it was just the stress. That she just needed time. He believed. Because he preferred to believe that than admit that something was being lost. Close friends sensed something was off. Some even tried to warn him, cautiously. But David, loyal by nature, refused to accept advice based on assumptions. He believed in the woman he shared his life with. And, more than that, he saw no real reason to be suspicious. Emma kept coming home, albeit later. She still slept beside him, still shared the same roof. For him, this was proof enough that they were simply going through a colder, but surmountable, period. There was no distrust. There was hope. The relationship continued, but something essential had been lost. Hugs took longer to happen. Fights, once rare, began to arise for small reasons but stretched into hours of silence. And just when everything seemed in need of a break, a definitive conversation, an emotional reunion, commitments, deadlines, and packed schedules arrived. And life went on, driven by routine. No one took the initiative to reclaim what they were losing. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because both, silently, already knew things were no longer where they once were. Emma, for her part, seemed to carry something on her shoulders that David couldn't decipher. An unspoken weight, a weariness that went beyond the overtime. Sometimes she'd stare out the window for minutes, as if searching for a way out. Other times, she'd wake in the middle of the night, restless. David noticed, but didn't ask. And when he did, he received vague answers. Still, he stayed. Still, he chose to stay. Because love, when true, doesn't give up easily. One day, she invited him to dinner with her coworkers. She said she wanted him to get to know the people she spent so much of her time with better. He accepted happily, with a gentle smile, unaware that that evening would mark a turning point in his life. He wore his best shirt, styled his hair more carefully than usual, and chose a unique perfume. He wanted to impress. He wanted to show her he was still the same man who had won her over years ago. And when they arrived at the restaurant, she seemed nervous but disguised it with elegance. The atmosphere was sophisticated, with low lighting, soft music, and well-spaced tables. Emma introduced him to everyone formally, but with a personal touch that only she could impart. Until the moment she pointed to a man in a dark suit, with a straight smile, and said, "This is Rick, my boss." It was in that moment, simple and quick, that something inside David trembled. He couldn't explain it at the time. The discomfort was sudden, like a cold breeze in the middle of summer. He shook the man's hand, smiled politely, and sat down. They made small talk, toasted the team's success, talked about trips and projects. Everything seemed normal. And yet, it wasn't. There was something in that smile. Something in the way she looked at him. something between the lines of what wasn't said. But that night, despite its discomfort, remained behind like just another one among many. There was no confrontation. There were no accusations. Just a silence that began to expand within David. And it was there, unknowingly, that he took the first step toward the end. The end of a story that, until then, he believed would last forever. The end of a love that began with whispered promises and now headed down a road of no return. And the most painful thing of all was that, at that time, he still believed he could recover. That he could save her. That he could save them. Because love, when it's true, refuses to accept that the other person no longer feels the same way. And that is the cruelest mistake of all. For days, David tried to ignore the unease that night had sown in his chest. The dinner, the introductions, the overly polite smile of the man introduced as his boss, all of it lingered in his mind like an insistent whisper, but he forced himself to believe it was just an impression, an overzealousness caused by the recent distance between him and Emma. He chose to say nothing, suppressing the discomfort in the name of balance, and tried to reconnect with his wife with more presence, more care, more of the small gestures that had always worked before. But she seemed increasingly distant, as if she were on a different rhythm, a frequency to which he no longer belonged. Even though they shared the same bed, he felt she was always far away, as if there were an invisible door between them, closed from the inside. The routine continued, fraught with silence. David began to notice details that hadn't existed before, or perhaps had always been there, and he simply hadn't had the eyes to see them. The messages she responded to hurriedly and without explanation, the smile she gave her phone, the way she dressed up more than was necessary for ordinary days, the intense perfumes she wore at odd hours, the rush to leave, the delay in returning. At night, she said she was exhausted, but her sleep seemed restless, and sometimes he saw her typing in the dark, the glow of her phone illuminating only her face. When he asked questions, she responded impatiently, avoided details, changed the subject. Something was changing, and David increasingly felt out of place in his own home. He wasn't a jealous man, never had been. He'd always believed that love was built on trust, and that excessive control was the first step to ruin. But faced with the growing coldness, he began searching for signs where he hadn't bothered to look before. He observed schedules, smiles, smells. One day, when he arrived home early from work, he found the living room door ajar and an unusual silence. Upon entering, he saw Emma finishing a quick call, her voice low and a slight smile on her lips. When he asked who she was, she replied without hesitation that she was a coworker working on a problem for the next day. Her answer was too quick, and her eyes didn't meet his. He felt the ground slip beneath his feet, but he said nothing. He simply noted that moment in his mind, like another piece of a puzzle whose image he wasn't yet sure would reveal. The following week, David began leaving work and parking his car a few blocks from home. He wanted to observe, to understand if it was all in his head. He began to feel foolish, like someone who made up drama out of insecurity. But every time she said she was leaving for a meeting after hours, something inside him stirred. That was how, one of those nights, he saw her enter a cafe far from the city center. It wasn't a common place for business meetings. He parked the car silently and remained there, in the dark, watching. Minutes later, he saw the same man from dinner arrive and sit across from him. The man smiled again, the same smile from dinner, and touched her hand across the table. David felt his stomach churn. There was no kiss, but the touch was intimate, complicit, too secure for a purely professional relationship. He remained there for long minutes, as if still waiting for a logical explanation that would disprove what his eyes had just seen. He returned home with his heart on fire and his mind in a fog. Emma arrived later that night. She said the meeting had run long and apologized for not letting him know. He simply nodded, without confrontation, without accusation. He still didn't know how to deal with it. Part of him wanted to believe he could still salvage something. Another part already understood he was facing an irreversible truth. In the following days, he began to gather small traces with the care of someone setting a trap for their own pain. He found deleted messages in his phone's history, smelled strange odors in stored clothes, heard whispered conversations that ended abruptly when he entered the room. And even with all this, he still hesitated. He didn't want to make a scene, he didn't want to invade privacy. He wanted to be sure. Deep down, he wanted to be spared greater pain. One morning, while searching for documents in her car, he found a folded note, forgotten in the glove compartment. It was short, direct, handwritten. "You were perfect yesterday. Let me know when you can do it again." There was no name, no date, but in that instant, everything collapsed. There were no more doubts, only the echo of everything he already suspected. He calmly folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and closed the car door as if closing a cycle. It was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. And yet, he still hesitated to confront her. He spent the entire day trying to imagine what her reaction would be. What she would say. Would she deny it? Would she cry? Would she confess? Or if she would have the courage to reverse roles and blame him for her absence, her monotony, her complacency. But when night came, David simply poured 2 glasses of wine, waited for her to sit at the table, and handed her the note. There were no words. Just the paper between his fingers. She read in silence, her eyes frozen on the letters, her body paralyzed. For seconds, time seemed to stand still. Then she took a deep breath and looked at him with a look that no longer apologized, but almost begged for understanding. She tried to mumble something, but he anticipated her and said there was no need to explain. That he didn't want details. He just needed to know since when. She looked away, muttering that there was no point in engaging in that kind of conversation. But he insisted. He wanted to know. He needed to understand how he began losing the woman he loved. And that was when she, in a dry whisper, confessed that it had started months ago. She said it wasn't planned, that it just happened, that she had felt alone, needy, invisible. Her explanation came in pauses, with flimsy justifications and confusing arguments. She talked about fatigue, about routine, about feeling lost, about wanting to feel something different. And the more she spoke, the more he felt everything crumble inside him. Because there was no hatred, no screaming. There was only a profound sadness, a sense of irreparable loss. It wasn't just the marriage that was crumbling. It was the image of everything they had built together. The years, the promises, the gestures, the anniversaries, the reconciliations. Everything now blended into a single word that hammered like a blade: betrayal. David didn't sleep that night. He walked around the house in silence, touching the furniture as if it could give him answers. The next morning, he quietly packed his bags, left his keys on the counter, and left. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't make a fuss. He just left. She stood at the door, unsure whether to call out to him or respect the silence. For the first time, she looked truly frightened. And he, even with his chest raw, moved on. Because there was no more room for him there. Because when love is betrayed, what remains isn't anger. It's absence. It's the feeling that everything you were to someone is no longer useful. But there was something David didn't yet know. Something still hidden, buried beneath the surface of his attire. Something that wasn't just a carnal betrayal, but a secret carrying the weight of a definitive revelation. And that secret was about to come to light. David completely withdrew after leaving home. He moved apartments, changed his cell phone number, requested a vacation from work, and went weeks without responding to anyone. Silence was his only means of survival, as if each word exchanged about the past were another cut in a body already too wounded. He still heard her voice in some early mornings, remembered the smell of her pillow, the sound of her bare footsteps in the hallway. But the clearest image was the note found in the car and the empty confession, without real remorse, as if it had been merely an emotional slip-up and not the destruction of the history they had spent years building. And as much as pride kept him strong on the outside, inside he faced violent waves of doubts, memories, exhaustion, and anger, not only for the betrayal, but for everything she had chosen to keep silent, hide, erase, without giving him the chance to try to save. The messages began arriving. At first, short, cold, formal. Then, longer, emotional, and confusing. She said she didn't know how to forgive herself, that she never imagined he would leave, that she even missed his silence. In one message, she said she needed to talk in person, that there was something important, something he deserved to know. David ignored her. He thought there was nothing more she could say that would change what was already dead. But her persistence grew, until one day, she received an email. No title, just an attachment. When he opened it, it was a photo, him, Emma, and Rick at a company gathering. The caption below read, "This was the last time we were all together without lies." At the end of the message, a dry sentence, "You need to know what happened after the divorce." David stood in front of the computer for minutes, his chest tight, his breathing heavy. He wasn't yet ready to open another door of pain, but something in that sentence made him know there was more. That betrayal wasn't just what he saw. There was another layer, deeper, more perverse. And against his own instinct, he decided to respond, arranging a meeting. He chose a secluded park, at dusk. He wanted an open space, with people around, but with the possibility of leaving at any moment. She arrived punctually, dressed simply, without heavy makeup or heavy perfume. She seemed smaller than he remembered, as if regret had shrunk her features. She sat across from him, her eyes red but steady. She thanked him for coming and said she didn't expect forgiveness. She said she didn't want to justify what she did, that there were no excuses, that what she destroyed between them could not be repaired. But she needed to tell the truth, not to soften the mistake, but to free him from continuing to believe that the problem was him. David remained silent, waiting. And that was when she began to speak. She said that, a few days after the divorce was finalized, she approached Rick. She wanted to understand what they would do from then on, since they had been involved for months. But he immediately changed his tone. He said it wasn't what they had agreed. That she was mixing things up. That what they had experienced was good while it lasted, but that now everything had become complicated. Emma insisted, tried to argue, said she had left her husband for him. Rick laughed mockingly and replied that he never asked for this. That she had confused the game with love. That she was the one who gave in, surrendered herself, and that now she wanted a kind of commitment he never promised. She recounted all this with a choked voice, trying to maintain her composure. She said that that day, Rick had thrown her out of his own house, where she'd gone unannounced. That he'd slammed the door in her face, saying he needed to save face. David listened in silence, still not understanding her point. Then she took a deep breath, looked him in the eye, and said that very day, as she was leaving Rick's house, she had a meltdown. She sat down on the sidewalk, called a friend in tears, yelled at her own shadow. And in that outburst of out of control, she'd made a mistake she couldn't undo. She grabbed her cell phone, called the company's HR department, and filed an anonymous complaint against Rick. She alleged that he had abused his position of power, pressured her emotionally, and lured her with promises he broke. The complaint escalated into an internal scandal. Rick, frightened by the repercussions, tried to defend himself, claiming that she was the one who stalked him, that he always maintained boundaries, that the affair was consensual, and that there were records of the messages, the meetings, everything. The conflict escalated. They called lawyers, opened an investigation, and evidence began to emerge. Emma was confronted by management and, facing the risk of being sued for slander and reverse harassment, tried to back down. But it was too late. The company terminated her with cause. And Rick was transferred to another unit, with his image tarnished, but protected by superiors who didn't want a bigger scandal. David remained silent, listening to every word as if his body were numb. She confessed not only that she had cheated on him, but that later, out of desperation, she had tried to destroy the career of the man for whom she had thrown away her marriage. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal now. It was the weight of knowing that she had been driven by a blind obsession, that, upon losing everything, she had tried to drag others down the same path. And in that moment, even though he felt compassion for seeing Emma so destroyed, something inside him broke definitively. She then said that, after all this, she realized she had never loved Rick. That what she felt was an escape from real life. That she had been carried away by vanity, adrenaline, the desire to be desired again. That she had traded stability for ego. That she wanted to feel alive, but ended up emptier than ever. She apologized. Not because she expected a fresh start, but because she understood, too late, the value of everything she had lost. She said she now lived alone, separated from her old friends, ignored by her co-workers, judged by her family. That everyone knew what had happened. That her name circulated in groups and hallways like a warning. And that every day it was harder to look herself in the mirror. David watched her for long seconds. He no longer felt anger. What existed now was something deeper and harder to define, the certainty that she would never be the same, and that neither would he. The love that had once united them was gone. It was dead, buried by thoughtless choices and cruel consequences. He stood up without saying a word. She tried to grab his arm, but he gently pulled away. He simply said that he forgave her, but that his life was now on a different path. And that, although the memory of her was still an open wound, there was no room for return. Not because he lacked love, but because he had become self-love. As he walked away, he felt a strange relief, as if he finally understood the size of the abyss that separated them. She remained there, sitting on the bench, watching the sunset with empty eyes. He walked on. And in that moment, each understood the true price of a wrong choice. The love had died, but the lesson, that one, still pulsed. And it was only just beginning to sink in. Davi looked back. He walked without haste, but with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Each step was a silent detachment from everything he'd ever felt for Emma. There was no more room for confusion. Love had died, yes, but now he was also beginning to bury his grief. And there was something liberating in that, a peace that emerged slowly, without shouting, without outbursts. Just silence and relief. For days, he focused on you again. He began walking more, going to different places, working more lightly. He avoided responding to messages from curious people, ignored social media, and no longer talked about Emma with anyone. That part of his life was fading away, like a house that was once full and is now just empty walls. But the universe has a silent way of turning full circle. And sometimes, when a story seems closed, it re-emerges in a different tone, with different pieces. 2 weeks after that encounter in the park, David received an unexpected invitation. A longtime friend, with whom he'd gone to high school, was organizing an informal reunion with old classmates. He almost declined, but something inside him, perhaps the desire to breathe fresh air, perhaps the desire to remember who he was before, made him accept. The event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a remote farmhouse, with a light atmosphere, soft music, and familiar faces. When he arrived, he was greeted with hugs, smiles, and surprised looks. Everyone knew, on some level, what had happened. But no one brought it up. They simply celebrated his presence as if he were an old friend returning from a long trip. It was there that he met Lara again. She had been his classmate. They hadn't been close back then, but he remembered her gentle way of speaking and the calm she exuded. Years later, there she was, with the same serene gaze, but now with a mature glow in her gestures and a laugh that broke any tension. They struck up a conversation by chance, laughing about old memories, sharing life paths. Lara had also gone through a divorce 2 years earlier. There was no betrayal, just the natural wear and tear of two worlds that no longer walked together. She spoke clearly, without rancor, but with the wisdom of someone who has lost and learned to rebuild. His encounters with Lara became more frequent. First, they were casual coffees, then walks in the park, and soon they became late-night calls that lasted hours. But David wasn't in love. Not yet. What he felt was something else, security. The feeling that, finally, he could be himself, without having to prove himself. Lara didn't demand anything. She listened. She didn't fill silences with theories or ready-made advice. She just was. And this silent, constant presence began to rebuild in him what Emma had destroyed, his ability to trust. A month later, during one of those long evening conversations, Lara mentioned something that made him pause. She said she'd run into Emma by chance, in a coffee shop. She'd seen her alone, staring out the window, her eyes empty. They didn't actually speak, but their gazes met for a brief moment. And Lara, without meaning to hurt, added, she seemed lost. David didn't respond. He felt a brief weight on his chest, not of longing, but of memory. It wasn't easy to forget so many years in such a short time, but it also didn't make sense to carry the past forever. Then, a week later, Emma showed up again. She sent a short message, saying she needed to deliver an item she'd forgotten. It was something personal, something David had forgotten about, but she insisted on returning it. She said she'd make sure to deliver it in person, that it would be quick. Against his better judgment, he agreed. They met at a discreet cafe, late in the afternoon during the week. She arrived changed. She no longer wore her usual exuberant clothes, nor her striking perfume. She was simple, discreet, almost unrecognizable. She handed over the small box with a hard-to-read expression. David opened it. It was an antique watch, a birthday present, a rare model he'd once mentioned losing. It was there, intact. She said she found it among her things and didn't have the heart to put it away. That the watch symbolized everything she had lost: time, presence, constancy. He thanked her with a restrained gesture and was about to say goodbye when she lightly took his hand. There was no resistance, but there was no reciprocation either. She looked into his eyes and said she couldn't sleep anymore. That she missed not only him, but who she was with him. That the regret was real and constant. That the worst punishment wasn't being alone, but knowing that the love she had thrown away now lived elsewhere. David listened without interrupting. For the first time, he saw truth in her eyes. A bitter, belated truth that no longer saved anything, but hurt like an open scar. She said she'd heard about Lara. That someone had mentioned it, and that she imagined he was rebuilding himself. She said it didn't bother her, in fact, she hoped he was happy. But her voice was shaking, and there was a visible effort to maintain his composure. David took a deep breath. He said he didn't wish her harm, that he understood everyone makes mistakes, but that what was destroyed between them could not be rebuilt. That the love that existed had become something irreversible. And that, now, he needed to move on. Emma nodded, her tears held back, and kissed his hand goodbye. An old gesture, like in the early years, but now charged with a definitive goodbye. In the following days, David and Lara grew even closer. There was no rush, no promises. Just two paths that met when they had already learned to lose. And it was in this mature space, free of games and fears, that true love began to grow. Not a desperate love, but a peaceful love, made of respect and shared time. David smiled lightly again, started cooking, planning trips, dreaming. For the first time in a long time, his heart felt weightless. Emma, on the other hand, watched life go on without her. He passed the same places with a constant sense of displacement. Conversations in cafes were always with strangers. The phone almost never rang. His former colleagues kept their distance. Family, though close, no longer spoke with the same warmth. With each birthday, I received fewer messages. With each day, I felt more deeply the absence of the presence I had once despised. And, ironically, it was this emptiness that now occupied everything. She never tried to destroy David's new relationship. She never sent offensive messages or tried to interfere. Perhaps because she knew, deep down, that he had completely escaped that cycle. That there was nothing more she could offer that would awaken any doubt in him. And it was in this understanding that her loneliness grew. Not as a punishment imposed by another, but as a direct consequence of her own choices. Because the worst regret is the one that comes too late, when there is no one left to listen, no one to understand, no one to wait. Years later, David and Lara walked together through a street market. They laughed at something simple, holding hands naturally. An ordinary couple, with a peace that only those who have experienced chaos understand as valuable. Emma passed on the other side of the sidewalk. She looked at them for a moment. David saw her. She looked away. And in that tiny, wordless moment, the three of them knew that time had done what it needed to. She walked on alone. They, together. And among so many things that could have been said, only one remained clear in the air: love only survives where there is truth. And truth, once betrayed, does not return. David began to see the world through a different lens after that last encounter. There was something different in his way of being, as if the layers that had previously bound him to painful memories had finally been peeled away with the silent force of someone who understands, without wanting to, the end of a cycle. The reunion with Emma, the apology, the belated acknowledgement of loss, all of that had served not as an attempt at reconstruction, but as a necessary final point. The pain was now just a discrete scar, present but not throbbing. And the curious thing was realizing that, even without wanting revenge, life had made a point of teaching her everything he could never put into words. Time, with its silent irony, took its toll silently, and it was up to him to simply move, step by step, toward a peace that now seemed finally attainable. Lara, with her serene demeanor and constant presence, became a reflection of everything he never had, or perhaps had forgotten what it was like. She didn't fill spaces with promises or exaggerated declarations, but with small actions that, day after day, showed him it was possible to love without fear, without distrust, without feeling like you had to earn every gesture. She saw him. Truly. Not for what he did or represented, but for who he was. And that, after all, was perhaps the purest form of reconstruction he could have experienced. Being with her was like returning home after a long storm, finding shelter where before there had been only wind and helplessness. But at the same time, there was a dilemma growing silently within him, not about what he felt now, but about everything he'd left behind. Because the past, even when no longer present, leaves its shadows. And Emma, though distant, still haunted certain thoughts with the force of an unfinished lesson. It was no longer love, no longer desire, but a moral unease. Something like a whisper that made him question to what extent forgiveness, granted definitively, was truly enough to free them both. She had lost everything, and yet, she hadn't victimized herself. She no longer tried to interfere. She didn't insist on return. She mourned alone, in silence. And this, somehow, weighed on David in a way difficult to name. Because, deep down, part of him knew that the greatest punishment anyone can face is to be fully aware of the love they destroyed with their own hands. One night, Lara noticed his distant gaze. They'd been together for a few months, sharing weekends, secrets, and even small plans for the future. But that night, as he washed the dishes more slowly than usual, she approached and asked bluntly if he still thought about Emma. The question wasn't accusatory, nor hurtful. Just direct. David stopped, dried his hands, turned, and said yes. That he sometimes thought about her. Not with longing, but with a mixture of compassion and pain. Because, regardless, she was his companion for years. And seeing someone he once loved fall into ruin because of their own choices left its mark. Lara didn't respond immediately. After a few seconds, he simply nodded and said he understood. That truly loving someone wasn't about erasing what came before, but learning to live with the memories without letting them guide the present. Their sincerity, in that moment, reinforced something that had been slowly building: trust. Lara didn't want to occupy a forced space. She didn't want to replace anyone. She simply wanted to be by someone's side, whole, even if scarred. And Davi, for the first time, felt he could be vulnerable without fear of being punished for it. The dilemma that haunted him was no longer about Emma. It was about what he would learn from all of this. Because the betrayal hadn't just destroyed a marriage, it had forced him to rethink his way of loving, trusting, and giving himself. And now, faced with a new, more mature, more real love, he needed to find a way to be present without fear. To not let the old wound contaminate the future. Meanwhile, Emma faced her days as if she were surviving. She returned to live alone in a smaller, more secluded apartment, without the objects that reminded her of her old life. He tried to resume his career elsewhere, but doors closed more easily than before. The story between her and Rick had spread, and even though many pretended not to know, the look said it all. Her former friends now limited themselves to formal messages on holidays. Her family still supported her, but there was a certain awkwardness at Sunday lunches, as if no one quite knew what to say. The silence, once chosen, was now imposed. And in her loneliest moments, she relived every step of what led her to this point. There was no escaping what he had done. The betrayal, the scandal, the desperate attempt to blame someone else, and finally, the end. She lost the man who knew her best. You lost the version of yourself that existed alongside him. Still, she didn't look for David anymore. You respected his choice to move on. He'd watched from afar, by chance, when he saw you at a market with Laura. The two of them were laughing at something silly, sharing a shopping cart, choosing fruit with a naturalness that cut through them. That made her go home and cry, not because she wanted to be there, but because she knew she no longer belonged in that world. The loneliness she felt wasn't a lack of company. It was a lack of purpose. And in that emptiness, all she had left was the memory of a love she'd killed on impulse. David, on the other hand, began to find beauty in things he'd previously ignored. A well-brewed coffee in the morning, a calm conversation without hidden tension, a pat on the shoulder that hides no secrets. Every simple gesture by Lara's side was a kind of healing. But even in this process of rebuilding, there were moments when he wondered, why does someone cheat? What drives someone to destroy what they've built with so much effort? And the more he reflected, the more he understood there was no single answer. That human beings are fragile, vain, and sometimes driven by needs they don't even recognize. But none of this justifies it. Understanding isn't the same as accepting. And the hardest lesson he learned from that story was precisely this: true love is not enough if it isn't cultivated truthfully. Loyalty, once broken, leaves scars that no justification can erase. It was during this period that Laura received an offer to move to another city. A tempting professional opportunity, but one that would bring with it a new dilemma: should she go it alone or take Davi with her? The invitation was laid out sincerely. She didn't demand anything, just told him and said she'd think about it later. Davi spent days pondering. He was comfortable where he was, but he was no longer attached to any place. What mattered to him now was being where peace was. And peace, he knew, was where it was possible to love without fear. He thought of Emma, of his old life, of the walls of the house where they'd lived. And he understood that what had held him back before was the fear of loss. Now, what guided him was the desire to keep growing. She decided to go. Not on impulse, not out of need, but because she knew there was something there worth living with courage. Emma learned of the move from a mutual friend. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew this was the last move. That after this, the past would be erased forever. And perhaps that's why, that night, she wrote the last letter she would ever send. Just to herself. Where she said, among so many bitter lines, that her biggest mistake wasn't betraying. It was believing she could recover after destroying. Because true love doesn't wait. It leaves when it can't find a place to live. And David. David found another home. And this time, she didn't intend to lose him. Davi said goodbye to the city on a Monday morning, while the sky still carried the weight of a night he insisted on staying. There were no grand rituals, just closed boxes, an empty apartment, and a key left on the counter. The car was already packed when he looked for the last time at the balcony where he had so often drunk coffee in silence, reflecting on what he couldn't understand. Now, all of that was part of a closed chapter, a book that, although still marked, no longer belonged to what he was willing to live. Lara was by his side, her gaze calm, unpressured. It wasn't about running away, it was about moving toward what made sense. And in that new city, where no one knew him for the pain he carried, he felt there was room to begin again with truth and lightness. The first few months were spent adjusting. New job, new routines, new smells on the street, new voices at the market. David, for the first time in many years, woke up with a guilt-free sense of fresh start. Lara's presence was like a silent anchor, not pulling him down, but holding him steady, even when the world seemed uncertain. They shared their days with complicity, but without rushing. They laughed at silly things, discussed what to watch on TV, invented recipes, planned short trips. And although shadows of what he had experienced still lingered, he felt he was learning to stop being the wounded man and become a whole man. The pain from before was now just a trace, a distant memory that, from time to time, surfaced in the silences, but no longer dominated his thoughts. One night, while they were having dinner on the small terrace of their new apartment, Lara brought up something he hadn't expected. With a direct look, she asked if he saw himself getting married again. The question came neither demanding nor expecting, but with genuine curiosity, the kind that arises when two paths intertwine without having to force their steps. David smiled before answering. He said he didn't know, but that if marriage ever made sense again, it would be with someone like her. Someone who respected his pauses, who understood his momentary absences, and who was willing to stay, even when love wasn't a spectacle, but simply a presence. Lara said nothing. She simply touched his hand for a few seconds and smiled back. And in that silent gesture, they both understood they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Meanwhile, Emma's life moved at a different pace. Her dismissal, social isolation, and the weight of her own choices forced her to look at herself with brutal honesty. She had abandoned therapy for a while, thinking she could deal with the consequences alone. But the days became repetitive and unbearable. Getting out of bed was a challenge, cooking became a chore she avoided with cold sandwiches and glasses of water. She no longer answered calls, didn't reply to her sister's messages, and avoided leaving the house to avoid the risk of encountering familiar faces who, even without speaking, said everything with their eyes. One day, she decided to return to the office. She sat down before the same therapist who had seen her briefly years before and confessed, bluntly, that she had destroyed everything she loved and didn't know how to move forward. In the following months, Emma plunged into a profound process of internal reconstruction. For the first time, she admitted to herself that she had always sought external validation to fill voids she couldn't even name. The betrayal, she understood, wasn't just physical. It was emotional, it was existential. She sought in another man a reflection of a woman who no longer recognized herself. And by trying to find herself in the wrong eyes, she ended up losing the one who truly saw her. Emma no longer tried to blame circumstances or take refuge in the narrative that everyone makes mistakes. Her mistake was conscious, painful, and exacted a heavy price. She also understood that, even with sincere repentance, some losses are permanent. Some doors, once closed, never open again. It was in this context that she decided to write to David. Not with the intention of winning him back, nor reopening wounds, but to thank him. For having loved him completely. For having been the man she, at the time, didn't know how to appreciate. The letter was long but honest. In it, she acknowledged the harm she had caused, the immaturity that blinded her, and said that if she could go back in time, she would have stopped to talk to him when things started to go wrong, instead of seeking answers outside herself. She didn't directly ask for forgiveness, but expressed that she finally understood the weight of the choices she had made. She ended the letter by saying that she wished him true happiness, and that, although they hadn't worked out, the love they shared deserved to be remembered as something real. David received the letter months after the move. He was at home with Lara when he saw the envelope. He recognized the handwriting immediately and knew, even before opening it, that it was final. He read it silently, his heart calm. There was no more anger. No more pain. Just a strange sense of maturity. What Emma was writing no longer had the power to unsettle him. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper, placed it in a box with other memories he no longer revisited, and went for a walk. He needed to breathe. He walked through the streets until he sat on a park bench, and there, alone, he understood that he had, in fact, closed a cycle. The betrayal, the divorce, the pain, the rebuilding, all of it was now part of who he was, but it no longer defined his choices. And most importantly, he no longer carried the guilt. That same night, he talked to Lara about the letter. He told her everything. He showed her the contents. There were no more secrets between them. Lara listened attentively, without judgment. When he finished, she simply said she admired the way he had chosen to handle it. That forgiving isn't forgetting, but rather letting the wound continue to control your steps. And that she was there, not to compete with the past, but to build the present. David hugged her tightly. And there, in her arms, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. The following days were marked by small rituals that sealed this new cycle. A weekend trip, a framed photo on the shelf, a dinner with old friends who were now also hers. Life, little by little, became normal. Not extraordinary, not epic. But real. And that was the greatest achievement. Emma, on the other side, was also beginning to find her feet. Still alone, still silent, but with greater clarity. She didn't get involved with anyone, didn't seek distractions. She simply tried to get to know herself, understand her own limits, and relearn how to live with what was left. She began to dedicate herself to social projects, to fill her time with something meaningful. And although loneliness was still her greatest companion, it was beginning to transform into solitude, the kind of silence that doesn't hurt, but teaches. And it was in this fragile balance between past and present that all the characters in this story finally began to walk more lightly. Not as someone who forgets, but as someone who learns. Because some stories don't need to be rewritten, just understood. And some choices, however devastating, serve to remind us that love, when true, requires daily care. And that the absence of that care can be the beginning of the end, even when the heart still beats. Time passed like a silent current that sweeps away everything, even that which seemed too firm to be carried away. Years after the events that changed the course of each person's life, everything had changed irreversibly. People remained, but they were no longer the same. Some scars healed, others still bled occasionally, but nothing remained intact. The story of love and betrayal that began with a simple dinner now existed as a distant echo in the memories of those who lived it intensely. However, the consequences remained engraved, not as bitter memories, but as marks that shaped what each person became. David built a new home where peace was the foundation. There was no longer room for distrust or hidden hurts. With Lara, he learned the value of silent presence, discreet complicity, and gestures that don't need witnesses to be genuine. The relationship wasn't a fairy tale, but real, solid, built on foundations that wouldn't crumble with time. They married in an intimate ceremony, away from the spotlight, surrounded only by those who truly knew them. Looking into her eyes and exchanging simple vows, David felt he had finally completed the cycle of rebuilding. Not because he'd forgotten everything he'd experienced before, but because he understood that some endings are actually new beginnings in disguise. Years ago, he believed his destiny was to remain with someone who betrayed him. Now, he knew his destiny was the peace of being with someone who would never give him reason to doubt. Lara, in turn, found in David not just a partner, but a mature mirror of everything she believed about love. She never wanted to replace anyone, never tried to erase the traces of his past, but she was firm in showing that love, when built with truth, needs no comparisons, only mutual surrender. Together, they began planning a family, not out of pressure, but out of shared desire. Their happiness wasn't reflected on social media, nor in forced smiles, but in their easy routine, their nightly conversations, and the peace of mind of knowing they didn't need to hide anything from each other. They became what many dream of being, two survivors of chaos who decided, together, to rebuild something new. Emma followed a different path. She remained alone, but not in the same way as before. Time had taught her, harshly, that certain decisions cannot be undone and that some losses are irreversible, not because of the malice of others, but because of the gravity of one's own choices. After years of therapy, volunteering, and emotional reconstruction, she achieved a kind of bitter peace, where loneliness was no longer a punishment, but a responsibility. She understood that loving someone isn't just about feeling, it's about caring, protecting, respecting, and that the day she stopped doing this, she killed the only true love she ever had with her own hands. She reconnected with part of her family, rebuilt bridges with friends, and found some purpose again in working with people experiencing emotional fragility. She began to talk about regret, not as a victim, but as someone who faced the worst of herself and survived. But fate still had one last twist in store. Years later, at a talk about starting over organized by an NGO, Emma was invited to share her story, as a testimony of someone who lost everything and had to rebuild herself. The audience was small, attentive, made up of people seeking inspiration amid their own shipwrecks. She spoke calmly, without trying to justify herself, simply telling the truth, that she had destroyed a marriage on impulse, that she had betrayed someone who loved her, that she had tried to cling to emptiness and nearly drowned. When she finished, she received a respectful applause. What she didn't know was that, in the back of the room, a young woman named Clara was sitting. Clara was Lara's daughter, from her first marriage before Davi. The young woman, now in her early 20s, had come out of curiosity and listened to everything without knowing exactly who the woman was, until, at the end of the talk, she found an old photo in the NGO's archives and recognized Emma. Days later, Clara, touched by the story and what she'd heard at home about David's past, decided to talk to him. She told him she'd attended a lecture, mentioned the speaker's name, and unintentionally, brought back a fragment of the story David thought he'd left behind. He listened silently, absorbing the information with an almost philosophical calm. There was no anger, no shock. Only a comforting certainty, everyone was where they belonged. He felt no desire to see Emma again, nor to reconnect. But for some reason even he couldn't explain, that night, he wrote a short letter, put it in an envelope, and asked Clara to deliver it if she saw her again. The letter simply said, "I have forgiven you, and I hope you have learned to forgive yourself too. May the peace we once lost now make sense to both of us, wherever we are." Emma received the letter weeks later. She was at home, reading, when Clara knocked on the door with the envelope in hand. She recognized the handwriting immediately, and as she read it, she cried for the first time in months. Not because of the content, but because she understood that, in that silent gesture, she found the final point she needed to close the cycle with dignity. She put the letter away, lit a candle, and sat by the window, watching the night fall. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty. She felt peace. A bitter peace, yes, but real. David moved on with Lara. They had a daughter. They named her Anna, after David's mother. He now smiled with the look of someone who understood the importance of pain. He was grateful for everything he had experienced, not because it was easy, but because it taught him what to never accept again. His love was now vigilant, not out of fear, but out of courage. And with Anna in his arms, on an ordinary Sunday morning, he whispered something no one heard: what was pain became love again. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy what's visible. It disintegrates dreams, erases futures, and tears up the foundation. Those who betray, almost always, don't measure the weight of what they're destroying. And those who are betrayed, even if they survive, never return to their former selves. Love, to exist, requires loyalty. And when that loyalty is broken, love dies, suffocated, even if the heart still beats. Betrayal isn't a slip-up. It's an emotional earthquake that leaves its ruins for years. And in this story, we saw how each person paid the price for their choices, some with the freedom to start over, others with the burden of living with what they let die. Comment below what you thought of this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share it with someone who needs to understand the value of loyalty. And remember, here, on this channel, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, because the pain of those who truly love is the same anywhere in the world. Betrayal destroys families, friendships, love, and above all, it destroys respect. And without respect, there is nothing left to save. Be faithful, be fair, be honest. Because those who trade the certain for the doubtful will one day realize that what they lost was everything.